Christopher Columbus, eat your heart out. NASA's gone exploring over 4 billion miles away.
We have a healthy spacecraft. We've just accomplished the most distant flyby. We are ready for Ultima Thule science transmission.
That's it.
Police say they're treating the stabbing of 3 people in Manchester last night as a terror-related incident.
Last night we experienced a horrific attack on people simply out to enjoy the New Year's Eve celebrations in Manchester. We are treating this as a terrorist investigation.
Also on PM this evening, why the Singapore economic model is both admired and despised by UK politicians. Rahul Tandon reports on India's increasing taste for craft beer. And 100 years on, the tragedy that took the lives of 200 World War I servicemen who were so close to home.
Some jumped into the water and they never made it. And some stayed on the boat just fearing what would happen. The fact that this came after peace had been declared seemed to add to the enormity of the tragedy.
With the BBC News throughout the hour, Neil Nunes.
After a wait of several hours, NASA has confirmed that its New Horizons probe successfully flew past the most distant object ever explored in our solar system, more than 4 billion miles away. Photos and other data it has gathered will be sent back to Earth in the coming months. More from our science correspondent Jonathan Amos.
It was a short radio message delivered from the far side of the solar system, but it contained everything scientists working on the New Horizons mission wanted to hear: that their far-flung probe was healthy and had a data bank full of pictures. The probe had been commanded to make an extremely close pass of a mountain-sized ball of ice and dust wandering far beyond the planets. Scientists believe Ultima Thule's frozen form and chemistry could provide new insights into how the whole solar system came into being billions of years ago. The first pictures are awaited with great anticipation.
Police have confirmed that the stabbing of 3 people, including a police sergeant, at Victoria Station in Manchester last night is being treated as a terrorist attack. A local man is in custody. The BBC understands that the security services are assisting the investigation. A man and a woman are in hospital with multiple wounds. From Manchester, Danny Savage.
Counter-terrorism police say the man arrested at Manchester Victoria Station last night is 25 years old and lives in the city. A property in the Cheetham Hill area is now being searched. The stabbing incident is being treated as a terrorist attack, with officers saying the location is a factor. The station is adjacent to the Manchester Arena, where a suicide bomber killed 22 people in 2017. The couple attacked last night are both in their 50s and live in the area. They are expected to remain in hospital for some time. Police say good quality CCTV shows how the attack unfolded.
A 34-year-old man has been arrested after a woman was fatally stabbed at a home in Camberwell in South London. The victim, in her early 30s, was found early this morning. And a man has been stabbed to death at a New Year's Eve party on Park Lane in central London. The victim is thought to have been working as a security guard. 2 other men and a woman were hurt. An 11-month-old boy has been pulled alive from the ruins of an apartment block in the eastern Russian city of Magnitogorsk, which collapsed yesterday. He's been reunited with his mother, who escaped but is said to be in a critical condition. 8 people are known to have died. More than 30 others are still missing. From Moscow, Sarah Rainsford reports.
Russian rescuers are calling this a New Year miracle. Baby Ivan was pulled from the rubble more than 30 hours after a gas explosion tore through his apartment block, sending 10 stories crashing to the ground. He was found wrapped in a blanket and in his cot after an emergency worker heard a cry from the heap of crushed metal and concrete. But the local health ministry says baby Ivan is suffering from frostbite, as well as multiple fractures and a head injury. The discovery has given fresh hope, though, to those involved in and following this major rescue effort.
The Archbishop of Canterbury has used his New Year's sermon to call for openness after what he called the divisions of recent years. Without specifying particular events, Justin Welby said society was struggling to disagree well, and he urged people to gather around common values and a common vision in 2019. The Prince of Wales and Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon have taken part in commemorations on the Isle of Lewis, marking 100 years since one of Britain's worst peacetime maritime disasters. 201 men returning home from the First World War died when the HMY Iolaire smashed into rocks off Stornoway and sank. 8 people in France have been rescued after spending their New Year's Eve in the cold, stranded on a funfair ride more than 160 feet in the air. The ride, a huge rotating metal arm, malfunctioned in the northwestern city of Rennes, sending sparks flying before coming to a halt. The last member of the group was eventually winched down 8 hours later. One of them said he would spend next year's New Year's Eve at home with champagne and biscuits.
I bet he will. Neil, thank you very much indeed. Now, there will have been more than a few fingernails chewed as they waited for news, but finally NASA has been able to confirm that its New Horizons spacecraft has performed a successful flypast of the most distant object ever explored in our solar system, the icy world of Ultima Thule, which is 6 billion kilometres from Earth. On last night's PM, you might have heard the mission operations manager Alice Bowman telling us how difficult it was to manoeuvre the craft. We'll just take a listen to the moment at Mission Control when, after hours of anticipation, it fell to her to check that all was well.
Mom, GNC?
Go ahead, GNC.
GNC looks good.
Copy. GNC is good.
All right, so that's guidance and control.
Yep.
Mom, propulsion.
Go ahead, prop.
Propulsion is green.
Copy. Prop is green.
Prop is green.
Mom, power.
Go ahead, power.
Power is green.
Copy. Power green. We have a healthy spacecraft. We've just accomplished the most distant flyby. We are ready for Ultima Thule science transmission at 200 UTC today. Science to help us understand the origins of our solar system.
That's it.
Well, PM has shared many an exciting space moment with Monica Grady. Tonight's no exception. She is, of course, Professor of Planetary and Space Sciences at the Open University, and she's with us again on the line live. Professor Grady, exciting enough when New Horizons reached Pluto. Of course it was, but now it's gone beyond that. Did you feel shivers down your spine?
Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, it's amazing when you're watching these things. I was watching NASA TV and I was watching Alice take these numbers down and, oh, yes, it's green. Oh, yes, it's nominal. And it's like fantastic. You know, as each system checks out, this is the housekeeping signal saying, yep, we're still working. We're still here. System nominal means it's working really well, which is, you know, a bit of an understatement. So, yes, it was really great.
And extraordinary to hear that, isn't it? And when you think about the vast expanse of space between Ultima Thule and Earth and the length of time it takes for those messages to travel, and yet that checklist, you know, all good.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, spacecraft seem to be so reliable these days, which is fantastic. So 6.5 billion kilometres away, 6 hours for the signal to get back to Earth, and it's saying, "Yep, all systems go. We're ready." And so there's an image which people can see, which it looks like a sort of 10-pin bowling pin, really, a skittle, and still not certain. This is the last image that was taken before the probe flew past. So this is a good image, but it's not the closest image. And that will start being downloaded tonight, about 8 o'clock. And I think there's another press conference tomorrow morning where they should reveal the latest image. But the really good images aren't going to come back until February and then over the next following year, because it takes such a long time to download them and interpret them.
You more than most can appreciate the nail-biting wait for those pictures to start coming through and for a clearer picture to emerge.
Oh, yes. But I mean, definitely, you always want something better. But, you know, you look what you've got and you think, right, actually, what can I tell from this fuzzy grey thing? Well, it looks as if it could be two fuzzy grey things with a slight neck in between, but you can't really tell, you know, but we already know how it's rotating, and that tells you about how big it is and gravitational pull and stuff like that. So whatever imagery or data you get, you can always learn something from it.
I love the fact that you say fuzzy grey things as well. So, we're not talking technical language, are we?
I don't want to get too technical.
No, thank you.
Fuzzy grey thing is... fuzzy grey thing's pretty good.
But can data from something like that give us much more knowledge about the formation of the solar system than we already have?
Well, it's pushing it a bit just at this limit, but just for us, because I'm not a specialist in image interpretation, but specialists who look at this and they will be able to tear apart the different pixels. They'll be able to look at the different shades of grey. They'll be able to look at how the shades change as the object rotates, and we'll be able to say, well, actually, perhaps there's a bulge on this bit and a valley on that bit, and something that might be a crater. And so, yes, once the computer people and the enhancement people get to work on data like this, they can find out a lot.
And very briefly, can this probe just keep going deeper into space? What's next for New Horizons? Very briefly.
Yes, it can and is going to keep going. It's got plenty of fuel. The problem is that it encountered Pluto in 2015. It's encountered Ultima Thule 4 years later, 3 and a bit years later. And we didn't know when it encountered Pluto that Ultima Thule was here. It was identified by Hubble Space Telescope, and because even though there are hundreds, thousands of these objects, it's a huge volume of space, and we don't know where all these objects are because they're so faint.
It's keeping
so
on
it
going.
Might find something.
We never know. Well, we will know soon. Monica Grady, Professor Grady, thank you very much indeed. 12 minutes past 5 now. Theresa May has said her thoughts are with those injured in a knife attack at Victoria Station in Manchester last night. Counter-terror police are continuing to question a man accused of stabbing 3 people, a local couple and a police officer. The Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, Ian Hopkins, said they're treating it as a terrorist attack.
Last night we experienced a horrific attack on people simply out to enjoy the New Year's Eve celebrations in Manchester. My thoughts are very much with the couple who are still being treated in hospital for their very serious injuries, and of course with the brave British Transport Police officer that was stabbed during the attack. I know that the events of last night will have affected many people and caused concern, particularly as the incident happened so close to the scene of the terrorist attack on the 22nd of May 2017. I believe this makes it an even more dreadful attack for our city. Let me give you some of the details of what happened last night. Just before 9 p.m, the British Transport Police officers at Victoria train station responded to a man armed with a knife and swiftly detained him. The officers acted with incredible bravery in tackling the armed attacker at the busy Metrolink station and ensured he was immediately detained. He remains in custody here in Manchester. We are treating this as a terrorist investigation, which is being led by counter-terrorism officers with support from Greater Manchester Police. They were working throughout the night to piece together the details of what happened and to identify the man who was arrested. This detailed work will continue, and we're currently searching an address in the Cheetham Hill area of Manchester, which is believed where the man has most recently been living. Our work will continue to ensure we get to the full facts of what happened and why it took place.
That's the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police. Our correspondent Danny Savage is at Victoria Station in Manchester. And a bit more, Danny, if you have it, about what the police are doing in Cheetham Hill.
Yes, Carolyn, been out to Cheetham Hill this afternoon. It's a small cul-de-sac off the main road that runs through Cheetham Hill. It's a residential area of Manchester, just about a mile or so outside the city centre. And what police are doing are searching a semi-detached property. Looks to have about 3 bedrooms. Neighbours say a large family live there. They think they have 4 sons and 1 daughter. And there are police standing out there on guard. There's obviously been a detailed search of that property which has taken place, because there's plenty of other police vehicles parked round there. And just in the last hour or so, we understand the police have taken away some members of the family themselves, not under arrest by the looks of it, but taken them away from the property. And as the Chief Constable was saying then, that this is the place where they believe that the man responsible for last night's attack has been living most recently. So that is where their detailed search is focusing on, but not police officers in forensic suits or anything like that. It does look more like a sort of routine search and investigation that's going on there at the moment.
And what do we know about the suspect?
Well, we don't know his name or identity at the moment, and I think it's fair to say the police do, but they're not telling us, and they don't have to. This is somebody they can hold for some time for questioning before they have to start the formalities of putting them through the court system if they're to charge them. So we do know that he's 25 years old. He's been living in Manchester. We know, it's reported that he was shouting "God is greatest" in Arabic as he was taken away by police officers at the station here last night. 2 knives were recovered here from the scene and taken in as part of the investigation. And because of what he's alleged to have shouted and said at the time of the attack, and as he was being led away by police officers, that is the reason that police are treating this as a terrorist investigation, as they describe it. So that is where their thinking is coming from, because of the man's actions last night, this frenzied attack, and what he was apparently saying and shouting at the time. They're trying to establish if he's a British national, and they're trying to build up a picture, I assume, of what is of where he's been in recent times, if there's anybody he's been in contact with. But the understanding that we get is that this was somebody who was operating in isolation, he was operating alone. You don't get the impression that there is a wider number of people that are suspects in this investigation. This seems to be somebody operating alone.
And Danny, what news of the victims?
Well, the victims, there were 3 of them. First of all, a couple who were passing through the station at the time, a man and a woman from Manchester. They're in their 50s. They both now have stab wounds sustained in the attack last night here on the platform. The woman is has a particularly nasty wound to her forehead. Both police say likely to be in hospital for some time. And the third victim, just briefly, a police officer in his 30s. He had a stab wound to his shoulder, and he's since been discharged from hospital, Carolyn.
Danny Savage, thank you. 17 minutes past 5 now. Time for a news update with Neil.
NASA has confirmed that its New Horizons spacecraft has successfully flown past and taken detailed pictures of a frozen rocky mass 4 billion miles from Earth. Scientists hope the data being sent back could provide new insights into how our solar system came into being billions of years ago. Police are treating last night's knife attack at Victoria Station in Manchester as a terrorist incident. And a baby boy has been pulled alive from the rubble of a 10-story building in Russia, which collapsed yesterday.
Now, for the next in our series on the way that our lives interact with big tech. Today, we're talking about politics, or rather democracy, and how it's been affected by technological advances, from Russian bots to Alexa taking over the remote control. Evan Davis sat down for a chat with the author of Democracy Hacked, Martin Moore.
Whereas we used to get much of our political information, our news about politics via the mainstream media, most of us now do that via the platforms. And those platforms being Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. They have, if you like, sort of infiltrated themselves between us and the public sphere and the media.
And they curate in a much more targeted way than the mainstream media. I could pick the Times or the Sun, same publisher, but very, very different newspapers. Google throws news at me, Twitter throws news at me, and I've chosen who I follow on Twitter rather than it's very much finer choice than there ever was between newspapers.
You've defined your sort of social network, and your social network helps to define your media environment, but also the platforms themselves. I mean, Facebook, out of every 10 items that Facebook could show you in your newsfeed, they show you maybe 2 or 3. So they censor out 7 or 8. All the time, they are tailoring what they think you would like, what they think you would engage with, based on your social network, based on your past precedent, etc.
Okay, so what's the thesis of your book, Democracy Hacked?
It's exactly that. It's exactly the idea that our communication system has been transformed, and in the course of the transformation of the communication system, we're also seeing our politics being transformed. And I was trying to understand really what that meant in terms of the opportunities that it gave both benign opportunities, but particularly the opportunities it gave to people to game, to distort, to take advantage of the systems, and really to try and help understand the extent to which the transformation helps us understand the volatility and the unpredictability of politics at the moment.
Right. So let's go into some of the negative effects, because people have observed quite a few. What would you highlight as the sort of the most destructive way in which the technology has changed public discourse?
I suppose the one that's most apparent at the moment is that these platforms give people many, many more opportunities to bypass some of the existing protections we have around political events, especially elections and referendums, where we have laws in place that have been around for 150 years to keep elections and referendums fair, free and open.
Identifying where the money's coming from, for example.
Exactly.
Who's behind a particular ad or whatever.
Keeping people's votes secret, so people it's not clear exactly what people are voting for, to try and protect their ability to make a decision privately. All these things, I think, are made much more difficult, even some of them completely superseded, by the opportunities that the new communication systems give.
The one that I would have thought a lot of people would focus on is the echo chamber effect, that if we don't have a shared media, we have our own media, because it's all personalised. In the end, you may never realise what everyone else is talking about, or you can live in a very different world to the other half. And that means you get much less discourse and much more division. Is that an effect?
Certainly, I think that's one of the effects. I think that the splintering of the public sphere into whether it's Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups or different echo chambers on Twitter is certainly one of the aspects. I think that's enhanced by the way in which some of these platforms work. So, to take Facebook and Twitter as examples, the way the platforms work is they, to some extent, deliberately enhance some of that echo chamber effect and the polarization effect, such that they encourage divisiveness and they certainly encourage sort of outrageousness.
Let's look at some of the good effects, because it's not all bad, is it? What would you highlight as one of the positives of technology allowing democracy to function in a more effective way?
One of the problems we have at the moment is the pendulum has swung so violently to one end of the scale. So if we think back to 7 years ago in 2011, many people were talking about the platforms as these sort of democratic angels almost. They were undermining authoritarian governments. They were inherently democratizing. And now we're talking about them as devils and undermining democracy. And I think, in many ways, they're both. You only need to look at many of the angst-ridden things that were written 2 decades ago about decline of participation in democracy, the way in which people were disengaged from the democratic process. So we need to be careful what we wish for, of course, because now we have, in many ways, the opposite. We have huge amounts of participation. Now, in some senses, that's fantastic. Who would argue against more democratic participation? But clearly, we've seen some of both the benign and malign effects of that.
We should talk about Cambridge Analytica, Russian hacking, meddling in elections. How big a problem do you feel that, say, was in America 2016 Brexit referendum? Are we thinking that has a really significant effect? Or are we like Owen Jones, who's a thoughtful chap who says, look, when you go and talk to people in Mansfield, they really weren't responding to the Russian bots. They really didn't like the EU and they didn't like everything it stood for. And you have to be careful about kind of telling them that they were manipulated in a way that they didn't understand.
We absolutely do. And I think there's a mistake at the moment where we're flailing around slightly to blame someone, to blame an individual or an organization or a state for this enormous amount of disruption and volatility, when actually it is the system itself. It is, as I say, the transformation of our communication system has enabled much of this to happen. Whilst I absolutely wouldn't say you can accuse the Russians of electing Trump or Cambridge Analytica of electing Trump or the alt-right of electing Trump, I think you can say that Trump would not have been elected had it not been for the transformation of our communication system. Trump would not have been elected without Twitter and Facebook. What we've seen is the use of these platforms by very motivated groups. And whilst we shouldn't blame any individual organization for winning the election for Trump, we can't ignore the fact that many, many individuals, states, and very wealthy plutocrats sought to take advantage of the new opportunities provided to put out very, very hyper-partisan news and to target it at particular individuals.
Are you jumping the gun, though, here on believing the effects of these technologies? Are you running too far ahead? Because you could take something like the American election. Still, a very large number of Americans do not use social media. They're not active on Twitter. They're only using Facebook maybe to look at family photos. They're not kind of, in a sort of political engagement on Twitter or Facebook. And hey, guess what? It turns out, I think, that more of them voted for Trump. That was the Trump base, in a way. What they were seeing was Trump on television every night. I mean, Trump might have hated the mainstream media, but boy, the mainstream media gave Trump airtime on a scale unlike any other candidate has ever had in an American election. I mean, isn't that what did it for him?
Well, they certainly did, didn't they? I think we have to expand this. To answer that question, we have to expand this beyond America. And that's so when I started looking at the US, and I started looking at what happened during the course of the US election. But if you start to pull the lens back and you look across the world, then we've seen shocks and unpredictable outcomes in elections across the world. And of course, there are individual causes, there are individual reasons why people like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, why people like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, why people across Eastern Europe, why they were voted in. But equally, when you look at the candidates that are doing particularly well, particularly the outsiders, the more extreme parties, the consistent factor that you find is their incredibly effective use of some of these new media tools. So Rodrigo Duterte, for example, who was an enormously unexpected winner in the Philippines, deliberately motivated 400 to 500 people, influencers on social media, to sort of campaign on his behalf to become what they call them Duterte warriors. If you look at Jair Bolsonaro, he and his supporters were communicating through tens of thousands of WhatsApp groups, and using those groups to kind of press very hyper-partisan news and to use peer pressure to get other people out to vote. So I think you're absolutely right to say we have to be careful exactly how much cause we put behind these platforms. But similarly, we have to recognise that actually that's one of the few consistent factors that we see across this sea of political turmoil and instability across the globe.
Let's look ahead 2 or 3 decades. Have you got in your head a picture of what it will look like and what it should look like? Because I don't even know whether, is Twitter going to exist in 20, 30 years' time, or will something really big have changed? I mean, where do you see it going long term?
I think you put your finger on exactly the right question, which I'm afraid I don't have the answer to. I wish. It seems to me that this is what we need. At the moment, we are flailing around, partly because no one, as far as I know, has set out exactly where we should be headed. I mean, do we want to live in a world in 10 years' time which is dominated by a small handful of American technology platforms? Do we want to live in a world, and I suspect the answer to this is a very, very strong no, do we want to live in a world like the one in China, where the government is collaborating very closely with technology platforms and has created this Orwellian system of social credit? Or do we want to live in a world which is very different, where the political system works differently, where technology is much more integrated to our politics? I don't know anyone, for me, who has really set out a vision of where we want to end up.
That was Martin Moore talking to Evan Davis. India is developing a new taste for craft beer. Sales of it are up by more than 40% and pubs are opening across the country. We tempted our correspondent Rahul Tandon to move from his usual roadside perch and seek out a drink in the country's beer capital, Bangalore.
Welcome to Toit. What would you like to drink? I've come to one of Bangalore's most fashionable pubs. Now, a few years ago, everybody in here would be sitting drinking whiskey. Now, they're all sipping pints of craft beer. Because for many of the young people around me, that is now India's most fashionable drink. Sibi Venkataraju owns this pub.
Primarily because craft breweries started making wheat beers. And no one till now, for some unfathomable reason, figured out that Indians would absolutely love wheat beers. Any brewery you walk into, 60 to 70% of their beer sales will be wheat beers. They're not very bitter, they're fruity, they can be a little sweet, very easy on the palate. Even amongst wheat beers, it's the Belgian wit beer. No one in Belgium ever thought that, that this is what India wants, but this is what India wants.
So what we gave you right now is what we call our sampler. We have 6 regular beers on tap. Nothing too strong, nothing too hoppy, but there's something in between and hopefully makes everyone happy.
I'm having a drink with the chief brewer here, Matthew Callahan from Ireland. Brewers are coming in from all over the world, such is the demand now here in India. Let's have a taste of this pint. Oh, that's nice. That's nice. But, you know, you could imagine that being made in Belgium, couldn't you? Do you think there's a specific Indian beer taste that's different?
Actually, both ways, but we're actually changing the Indian palate. And I don't want to be rude or anything, but a lot of people think, all right, they want strong beer, get drunk as fast as they can. But now I think because of not just us, but because of other small breweries starting up, it's more for the flavor, the enjoyment.
Around 40 people reportedly barged into a pub and viciously attacked girls who were at the pub.
There are lots of women who are enjoying their draft beer in this pub, but that hasn't always been the case. As you heard in that news report, over the years there have been attacks on female drinkers. So with India's craft beer revolution, are attitudes changing? Let's find out.
Maybe yes. They're fans of beer. Beer is subtle thing and you're getting flavors, so why not? I think it is changing. I think now both the genders are drinking. My parents would mind me drinking at home, so they don't know that I drink. It will take a lot of time for the whole community to accept.
It's definitely there. I would tell you, even at places sometimes when you are going out drinking and all, you see eyes looking at you, oh, she's drinking.
I've left the pub and I've come for a cup of chai. Whilst the sales of craft beer are going up by more than 40% a year, more and more states in this country are considering imposing prohibition. So what does that tell us about India's attitude to alcohol? With me here is the columnist Sandeep Roy.
India has a somewhat schizophrenic attitude to alcohol. Actually, people drink it all over the country, but in some parts the government has a morally pious attitude and decide to prohibit alcohol for social reasons. And in other parts, the government decides that alcohol is actually a good source of tax revenue, and so they keep the bars open later and reduce the numbers of dry or no alcohol days in order to maximize that tax revenue.
It's closing time back at this pub, and it's last orders. All the people around me are sipping craft beer, so if you can't beat them, might as well join them. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before.
Rahul Tandon. It's tough work, but someone had to do it. Well, now, it is a new year, of course, and it can be a time for reflection and a look back at history for some answers.
People were wrestling with some of these issues 1,000 years ago.
The Long View with Jonathan Freedland.
The Long View takes a current issue and finds a historical precedent.
Understanding the present by studying the past.
We're saying, look, we've been around this block before. We got through it before, and perhaps even there are some lessons we can learn.
The new series begins with the Conservative Party divided over how Britain should trade with the rest of the world. In the early 1900s.
Human beings have an uncanny habit of replaying the same dramas again and again.
The Long View returns next Tuesday morning at 9 on BBC Radio 4.
It's 5:33, time for a PM News Summary with Neil.
Signals from the New Horizons spacecraft have confirmed that it's successfully flown past the most distant object ever visited by a probe. It took photos and gathered other data from Ultima Thule, an icy mass on the outer reaches of the solar system 4 billion miles away. Scientists hope the information could provide new insights into how our solar system came into being. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Berman, has condemned as vile last night's attack at the city's Victoria Station, which police are treating as a terrorist incident. A 25-year-old local man is in custody. A couple in their 50s are in hospital with multiple wounds. A police officer was also stabbed. The new president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, has been sworn into office in the capital, Brasilia. He's the country's first far-right leader since the end of military rule in the 1980s and has promised to relax gun laws, roll back bureaucracy and tackle corruption. An 11-month-old boy has been pulled alive from the ruins of an apartment block in the eastern Russian city of Magnitogorsk, which collapsed yesterday. He's said to be in a critical condition. 8 people are known to have died. More than 30 others are still missing. The family of a retired U.S. Marine who's been arrested in Russia on spying charges have insisted that he was in Moscow for a wedding and is innocent. They say they are deeply concerned for Paul Whelan's well-being. The stock markets in London and New York are closed for the New Year holiday. Against the dollar, the pound is trading at $1.27.5. Against the euro, it's at €1.11.6, which makes the euro worth 90 pence.
Many thanks, Neil. The Hebridean Isle of Lewis has been marking the moment 100 years ago when more than 200 people drowned just yards from the shoreline and the safety of home. In the early hours of the 1st of January 1919, the naval yacht HMY Iolaire, which was carrying sailors returning from the First World War, hit rocks as it approached Stornoway and sank. Today's centenary commemorative service with songs sung in Gaelic was attended by, among others, the Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Prince Charles. Years later, Murdo McFarlane and two girls involved in the fishing industry there described what they'd seen at the wreck site the following morning.
The breakers were racing ashore, and you could see drowned sailors on the crest of the waves. They were like war horses racing, galloping from the field of battle, with their riders dead in their saddles.
The whole island felt it. The sadness, you could feel it in the air. The sea was their livelihood. The sea caved, and the sea took it away.
Now, for days afterwards, old men and young lads could be seen waiting on the edge of the sea to see if the crew of the sea would at least give them back the bodies of their drowned dear and near ones.
Well, there's recently been a book written about the tragedy called The Darkest Dawn. Agnes Rennie, whose own great-uncle was lost in the tragedy, was involved in publishing it.
Armistice had been declared in November, so we are now at the following Hogmanay, a couple of months on, and everybody is looking forward to coming home in peacetime. Scottish servicemen were given the New Year leave if they preferred, as opposed to the English servicemen who often took the Christmas holiday. So there was great excitement and looking forward, and many, many people looking to come home on leave. And they arrived in Kyle to discover that the usual mailboat who would travel to Stornoway was not able to accommodate everybody who was looking for a place. So she was supplemented by the HMY Iolaire, who sailed that night with a great many people on board and set off for Lewis. And it was a terrible night. It was a force 8 storm blowing, and unfortunately she never made it.
How close did she get to home?
She got so close to home that earlier today I was actually listening to one of the archive recordings of one of those who was on board, who describes how he stood on the listing deck and imagined that actually as a young boy he could probably have jumped as far as the distance from the deck to the rocks, but realised that probably in the circumstances he wasn't going to be able to do it. So that was how close they were to home. That was how close they were to the shores of home. 79 people survived, amazingly, out of the 280 people on board.
So there must be tales of amazing bravery as well from that night.
Oh, unquestionably. One famous gentleman, John F. MacLeod, managed to swim ashore carrying a rope with him. And on that rope, some 40 people managed to cling, hang on, cover the distance with the rope. Some went onto that rope who never made it, who were swept off by the raging seas. Some others simply jumped into the water and managed to swim ashore. Some jumped into the water and they also never made it. And some stayed on the boat just fearing what would happen, but also hoping against hope that there might be some rescue. There were many sets of brothers and uncles and so on board. Famously, one young man who managed to swim ashore realised that he couldn't see his brother, swam back out, and his brother made it, but he didn't make it back. And lots of these kind of tragedies. Others who made it ashore and who were so overcome by cold and by having been thrown and injured onto the rocks that they didn't make it either, because 100 years ago, 2 o'clock in the morning on a winter's night, there would have been no lights and there would have been no sense of where to go.
And your own great uncle was among those lost.
Yes, my grandfather's brother was one of those who was drowned and whose body was found along with many, many others on the nearest shore the following morning. He was making his way home to be with his widowed mother and his brother and sister, and when he was found, he was tragically found with an engagement ring in his pocket, an engagement ring which was destined for a young girl who never said who she was, and there was nothing to indicate who she was in his pocket either. So it's one of these really, really tragic stories out of very many that were associated with that time. The fact that this came after peace had been declared seemed to add to the enormity of the tragedy, and I suspect that that's what left it so hard for communities to cope with.
Oh, absolutely, because apart from the huge personal cost to so many, a terrible toll on Lewis as a whole.
Indeed, and I think it's fair to say that with the benefit of hindsight we can see how that influenced the number of young people who then chose as their next step to emigrate, to move to the mainland, but many joining the emigrant ships that headed for the States in the early 20s, taking with them a whole generation of young people, many of whom never returned.
Nowadays, of course, we have inquiries, don't we, after accidents like this. And in this case, exactly that happened. There was an inquiry, wasn't there? But it only lasted 2 days and really left more questions than answers, didn't it?
There was an inquiry as a result of public demand, community demand. There was outrage that initially it was thought proper not to have an inquiry. But in the event, the inquiry was seen to be very, very unsubstantial, and certainly in its brevity and in its lack of calling witnesses, some of whom were thought to have been more than adequate to have appeared as witnesses. They were never given the chance to appear and tell their story. So it certainly gave no closure at that time.
How was the island directly after the tragedy? Were people able to speak about it?
In many circumstances, people weren't able to speak about it. And again, I think we have to see this in the context of all that had gone before, because there had been so many hundreds of people lost in the course of the war that there was hardly a home throughout the islands which had not been touched in some way. And so whether as a result of grieving for somebody who had been lost, or certainly in the case of the Islair, I think it's now fairly well recognised that what would now be termed post-traumatic stress disorder certainly affected many of those who survived, and they found it very, very hard to talk about it. And it's been amazing to us to discover that the book that was recently published by Aker, the publishing company I work for, it's been as a result of looking through that book that some families have discovered that some very close relatives had been on board and they had never known that. It's very difficult, I think, in this modern age of access to information and immediate transfer of information to think of how that would have been, how that could have been the case. But such it was, and 100 years on, it's almost as if it's gone completely full circle, and the community, as a community, is seeking to recognise those who were on board, those who were lost and those who survived, none of whom are around nowadays, of course, and as a community to come together to both recognise, to grieve and to look forward.
Agnes Rennie there, remembering the Iolair tragedy 100 years ago. It's 5:44 now. Neil's back with a reminder of our headlines.
A NASA probe has made contact with Earth, having successfully flown by the most distant object ever explored in our solar system, an icy rock 4 billion miles away. Scientists hope the photos and other data being sent back will provide new insights into how planets were formed. Police have confirmed that the stabbing of 3 people, including a police sergeant, at Victoria Station in Manchester last night is being treated as a terrorist attack. Brazil's new far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been sworn into office.
The Singapore model. We hear a lot about it. The nation's economy has been extolled by some Conservatives, most recently the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. Indeed, he's visiting the country today to work out what lessons the city-state might have for a post-Brexit Britain. For many on the left, though, Singapore spells a nightmare vision of a low-tax, low public spending, low-regulation economy. So what exactly is the Singapore model? As so often, we turn for an answer to Professor Linda Yu, economist and author of The Great Economists, and she's here with us in the studio. Welcome to you. Can you explain, in simple terms, the Singapore model, how it works?
Well, there's probably 2 facets of the Singapore model to really remark on. One is that the government has been very good at finding a balance between directing economic activity towards high-tech manufacturing and services, but at the same time encouraging businesses to flourish in entrepreneurship. And because it has that strong domestic economy and prosperous economy, it is a global trading hub, very well suited for the 21st century. In other words, Singapore has free trade agreements with the United States, with the EU, with China, with Japan, with about 24 countries, really cementing its place as a trading hub, really for a place that doesn't actually have a lot of the natural advantages you might think of, such as natural resources or cheap labor force. And that's why I think the Singapore model gets mentioned quite a lot as something at least to look at post-Brexit.
But can the UK be compared with Singapore? I mean, Singapore's a city, not a country. The UK population is, about 13 times as big. Different size, different cultures. Can they be compared?
I don't think they can be compared. I think there are probably elements of the Singapore model to look at as to what can be potentially adopted in Britain. But it's absolutely the case that Singapore's own Prime Minister has said that Singapore is not a model for Britain after Brexit, because he said, for one, for a city, it's easier to strike that balance between directing activity and encouraging private entrepreneurship. And he says part of the key to that is that it's a low-tax country. So social spending is only about 16 or 17% of national output, and we spend between 40 to 45% of national output on things like pensions, the health service. And so that would actually be one of the biggest differences between saying this kind of regime works for a city. Do you really think you can get that kind of system to work for a country of 60-some million people?
Well, I mentioned the critique and the criticism that there's been by senior Labour figures. They say that this sort of model risks jobs. It risks growth. It only really benefits the wealthy and the bankers because it is a low tax, low public spending, low regulation economy. They don't certainly see it as the way forward.
Well, I think certainly there are certain elements of the Singapore model that's worth looking at, but also I think there's important things to stress which are different. One is that Singapore works really well because it has a history. It's within Asia, which has established supply chains, but not the single market. We are coming at it from a different context. So we have a history of supply chains, of the way that the single market links different markets. So by taking one model and saying, well, actually, it's worked for them, low taxes, low regulation, it'll work here, it probably doesn't really reflect how we need to go about doing Brexit. But I think the bigger point is it is a if you have low corporate taxes, you are going to end up with lower tax revenue. Lower tax revenue implies you're going to do less social spending. So it's a political decision as to what kind of country you think you want, and then the economics behind it has to support it. So it works for a city. It's very prosperous, but there's a lot of other things about Singapore that may not appeal, like high wealth inequality.
And civil liberties, freedom of expression curtailed far more there than here.
Exactly. And 85% of the population live in some form of social housing. And so there's, I think, things to look at. And the one thing I would stress we should look at for Singapore is they're very good at encouraging competitiveness and innovation. And that's why Dyson has located its electronic car company to be there in Singapore, despite the high wages. So to me, that is probably the one thing we ought to look at after Brexit.
Linda Yu, thank you. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the economic crisis in their country. According to the United Nations, 2.3 million have left since 2015. Superinflation's taken a grip on everyday life. Many have sought refuge in neighbouring Colombia, which is a strategic ally of the United States. Well, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in fact, is expected in Colombia tomorrow to meet the president there, Ivan Duque. He's asked countries that defend democracy not to recognise the government of Nicolás Maduro, who starts a new term of office as Venezuelan president this month. PM's been receiving regular updates about the state of life in Venezuela from the journalist Carlos Camacho. Here he talks to our reporter Poppy Damon about his year.
A la Venezuela consciente, vamos a apostar por el bien de nuestro país.
It started with a WhatsApp message on the day that a drone bomb appeared to make an attempt on Venezuelan President Maduro's life on August 4th this year.
Hello, group. President Maduro talk at length.
Carlos Camacho is a Venezuelan journalist who started sending a group of BBC reporters almost daily messages about the deteriorating situation in Venezuela. He's in his 40s and lives with his wife and 9-year-old daughter in Caracas.
Hello, power is back on where I live, but around the Miraflores Presidential Palace, it's out again. Every time there's a blackout there, neighbors come out, protest. But downtown Caracas is mostly without power still at this time, local time.
21st of August, nationwide 24-hour labour strike in progress. The situation in Venezuela means citizens struggle to get basic medicines. On one day, Carlos saw a young boy in distress at the supermarket.
Good morning. Grocery shopping with my wife, and a young kid, a street kid, has an epileptic seizure. Obviously, lack of medication. So the father, who is also a homeless person, obviously, drags him towards a can, works as a stool, and just sits him there, and the kid still hasn't come out of it. It's one of those things you see in Caracas every day that really, really puts everything in perspective.
28th of August, a picture of a tub of ice cream surrounded by candles. Powerless in Caracas. All the ice cream has to go.
I was driving down the street the other day and I heard some detonations. So I asked this motorcycle messenger that I know was there, what's that? And he said, oh, that's just some car, backfiring.
Carlos is a music fan. You can hear the stereo playing in many of the messages. 2 weeks ago, he said he was selling off his prized vinyl collection to make some extra cash. When I asked Carlos if I could stitch together all his messages for this piece, he agreed, but only if
we can title it Economic War Diaries. Well, I'll be happy. I love that title because Maduro's always insisting there's something he calls the economic war being waged against him by the US and its local allies.
Sometimes Carlos sent voice messages, sometimes pictures. 31st of August, a picture of an empty fridge. Sign reads, meat. 2nd of September, the picture of a shopping trolley empty and supermarket shelves also empty. It was like a personal news bulletin to all of us.
This is Carlos for Economic War Diaries here in Caracas. Can you hear the detonations?
16th of November.
Sounds like sporadic shooting there. Let's not forget Venezuela, one of the most dangerous countries in the planet. It has something like 30,000 murders a year, up from 3,000 in 1999. So that's a tenfold increase in less than 20 years. Demographics don't explain that surge in violence, but impunity does. What NGOs here say is that all this violence is because of impunity. Last year, the Attorney General in exile, well, now in exile, Luis Ortega, herself a victim of impunity, said that something like only 8% of murders are prosecuted. You hear that? We don't know what's going on, those deaths or detonations, but it's definitely a reminder, you know? So this week there was a massacre. There's another word for it. Police entered a squatter's building and killed 7 of the occupants. So, you know, that's the city I live in. Hear that?
I asked Carlos if we could connect and he could speak to me about this year.
Hello, this is Carlos Camacho in Caracas, Venezuela.
I asked Carlos if he was planning on staying in Venezuela.
I'm basically the holdout. People from my high school class, more than half, are in Spain, Colombia, or the US.
If you don't mind me asking, Carlos, have you considered going and what do you think keeps you there at the moment?
My particular age and formal education group, I'm a holdout. Most people with 1 or 2 degrees have left. You know, it's hard. I was born here. I was taught, you know, to love this country, and I love it. I love it with a passion. I start talking to a fellow reporter thousands of kilometers away. What can I say? I get misty-eyed. I mean, I tell my daughter every day, oh, this is a fantastic country, Isabel, don't you give up.
Will you be able to celebrate in any way for Christmas and New Year?
We get together every year, you know, or those of us who are still here. It's going to be sad, but I still think we're not there yet. We're not at the point of no return yet. We can turn this around.
That was PM's Poppy Damon there, documenting a year in Venezuela. Now let's take a look at what's coming up next week.
In Britain, the freedoms we have today, whatever you think of them, didn't just happen by accident.
A new series exploring the long history of struggles for liberty in Britain.
A large part of Magna Carta is designed to restrict the money-getting activities of royal government.
It's not until 1807 that Parliament actually banned the slave trade.
By the 1870s, we have a much freer press in that sense.
What happens when those freedoms come under pressure?
I was told repeatedly what you've done could make you go to prison for life. And I kept saying, what have I done? Well, what's the charge?
The battles that won our freedoms. Next Monday to Friday at 1:45 on BBC Radio 4.
Louise Lear's here now with the weather. How's it looking?
Hello there. Well, change of wind direction for the change of year, and it's brought a little more sunshine for those lucky people out there. Not for all of us. We did have a band of cloud really across Wales, the Midlands, and that's sinking its way south and west as we speak. But there has been more sunshine around today. As a consequence, it's not been quite as warm, where we've had the sunniest slice of the weather really across northern England, southwest Scotland. Temperatures have struggled. 5 to 7 degrees the high. And where we see the clear skies through the night tonight, well, those temperatures will continue to fall away quite sharply. So we're going to wake up tomorrow, 2nd of January, to quite a widespread frost in western areas. Temperatures getting down as low, generally around -1 to -4 degrees, but maybe in the coldest spots in the far north, we could see -5, -6 degrees. Now, the exception to this is along North Sea coast because we've dragged in a northerly wind and that's bringing more cloud in off the North Sea, maybe just the isolated shower as well. But here, that will prevent temperatures from falling much lower than 3 or 4 degrees. So we start off tomorrow with a west-east divide, cold and frosty in the west, Sparkling skies, lots of sunshine, a beautiful winter's day developing. Further east, we keep the cloud. Across East Anglia and the Kent coast, always the risk maybe of a few isolated showers. Here, not quite as cold. Top temperatures tomorrow between 4 and 8 Celsius.